Good morning, family. This is Aunt Beth. Welcome to my lamppost. So, this morning I wanted to give you a seed thought about wine or vinegar. It's really our choice. What is the taste that we leave in people's lives at the end of our life? And this came from thinking about unforgiveness and bitterness. I think one of the most terrifying phrases in the New Testament is that Jesus warns, if we don't forgive other people, he cannot forgive us, which locks us out of heaven in all eternity. And that's pretty terrifying. But what about what that does for us during our life? So I'm going to tell you a story. It's about my grandparents. They both lived to be about 99 years old. And because I lived close to them out here on the East Coast, my mom asked me to stop in and see them at least once a month, which I did, over a period of 20, 30 years. So I got to know them pretty well. And it was interesting because they'd been married for 70 plus years by the time they passed away. My grandfather was absolutely fabulous. You just smile when you think about him. And he, towards the end of their life, they were in a nursing home. And I would go up to visit with him and bring my laptop, and we would type a letter to his oldest grandchild, who was out on the West Coast. And he'd be dictating to me, and then I'd have him press the send button. And he was just amazed at the technology. I'm typing away. And he's talking about what a lovely day it is outside, and I'm like, yeah, right. and all the wonderful things. And, they had this bath where they lowered them in like a saddle in this bathtub. And he thought it was the most wonderful thing. He loved going to the dining halls and see all his friends. Didn't have to cook, didn't have to clean, had this wonderful bubble bath. Everything was so wonderful. Now, the same set of circumstances with my grandmother. Didn't want anybody touching her. She wasn't happy with anything that they cooked and cleaned and whatever. She didn't want people touching her stuff. It was the same set of circumstances, but the differences, she was terrified of being left behind. So she had my grandfather promise that she could die first. So my grandfather was very loving and kind. So she did die first. And then almost a year to the day, my grandfather got sick, and my dad told my mom, you better get out there. It's not going to be long. And within the week, he was gone. At my grandmother's funeral, there was family. That was pretty much it. At my grandfather's funeral, even people that he'd worked with, 30 years earlier when he retired, and then he worked as a consultant engineer afterwards for about 10 years. But even people he'd worked with 30 years earlier showed up at the funeral. Funeral was packed. And that made a huge impact on me. same set of circumstances, and one person is just rejoicing and loving life, and the other person is so frustrated that things aren't going their way. And then I thought back, and just asking God, why is this? And God reminded me of a story that my grandmother had told me years before. And at the time, you just sort of let it go. But during the Depression, they had lived in like this housing, and in St. Louis, and this is when they had coal to heat their homes. And they were like the early version of townhomes with a shared cellar that was partitioned off. And she was very upset, bitter, and angry still, 70, 80 years later, about the lady next door that had taken some of her coal to heat their homes with. And I don't know if it ever occurred to my grandmother that maybe these people didn't have any money. But 70 or 80 years, she held on to that little tiny thing. She wouldn't forgive that lady. 70 or 80 years later, she was still talking to me about that. And you just wonder if that little seed of unforgiveness and bitterness just sort of flavored and poisoned her whole life. Where, I loved her. She was kind. She had a tender heart. But there was this streak of bitterness, and every once in a while you'd run into it, and it just sort of, as far as your time with her. So not for just eternity as far as forgiving others, but how it flavors our personality. Wow. I want to be like my grandfather, Not that I want to die, but nobody gets out of here alive. But at the end of my life, I want people to have a good taste in their mouth over my life. I want the fruit of my life to turn into wine, not vinegar. But the only way I can do that is keep my nose clean on a daily basis. If there's something that's bothering me and something that's hurting me, I gotta deal with it, but not let it sour and get bitter on the inside of me. One of the pastors I had, it was a good friend of mine, he's now deceased, but he said, forgiving is almost double giving. It's not a feeling. But you forgive them and then pray for them, and that'll help you heal from any seed of bitterness that might be working its way through and poisoning your system. So, seed thought. May we all be fruitful, but our lives be a refreshing drink instead of having the taste of bitterness in other people's mouths and in the Lord's. So, seed thought for you. Have a fabulous day. All God's best.